Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's still here, but we can start anyway. How are you enjoying it so far? I hope you've all been on lots and lots of calls so far. So, lovely Sunday afternoon history lecture for us. This is the cheese equivalent of finding a really good documentary after your Sunday lunch. We're going to do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through cheesemaking, European cheesemaking, with a quick dash across the ocean, and to talk a little bit about how people's lives and geography and politics and economics have all fed into cheesemaking and how cheesemaking has also influenced them. My name's Katy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Education Project Manager for Academy of Cheese. I am also a keen cheesemaker at home, and I've worked as a cheesemaker and an affineur and as a cheesemonger for around 15 years now. And I have specialised in technical advice and also cheesemaking education. And I have a pet love for history and historic cheesemaking. So I'm hoping to share that with you. A big part of what I also do with the Academy is we've introduced some amazing little seminar groups that I've been hosting for the level 1 self-study students. So this is very similar to the sort of things we're doing in that. So those of you that are thinking about taking level 1 or level 2 through a self-study route, these are the sort of things that we have available for participants. So I hope some of you got some cheese in front of you. I hope some of you have got the amazing cheese selection from Courtyard Dairy, who are just up the road from me and amazing friends of me and the Academy of Cheese. I have some really delicious cheese here. If you don't, I hope you've got some cheese or that you've eaten lots of cheese today already. So I'm going to very, very quickly whiz us through the whole of prehistoric cheesemaking, which you'll have to hold on to your hats. Cheesemaking is something really ancient that humans have been doing almost as long as they've been farming. We've found cheesemaking evidence for going back almost 4,000 years, if not further. It became very quickly an essential foodstuff. The cheeses we're going to talk about this evening are not ancient cheeses, though they are historic. But what I hope to illustrate is because cheese became so important to so many people so quickly, it became something that evolved as the people who were making it evolved and changed and their communities changed, because it was something that most people were eating, and if not making, almost every single day. And so when you're making cheese, and this is any cheese, whether you're in a massive factory or you're mucking about with a bit of milk on your stovetop, the tiniest little tweaks can send your recipe careering off in a completely different direction. And so if you look at the cheeses you have in front of you, or that I have in front of me, these all started in the same way. They're all cow's milk cheeses. They are all acidified using similar-ish bacteria. They all use some rennet. Yet they're all so completely different. So the cheese I'm going to start talking about is cheddar cheese. We've got on our little boards a most magnificent piece of Havod. This is a cheddar made in West Wales, and a cheddar which the cheesemaker spent an enormous amount of time on getting this recipe right, that involved them going back to cheesemaking textbooks and illustrations over 100 years to start to get a feel for a recipe that was, as the cheesemaker described it, where their milk wanted to be. They felt like they were making a delicious cheese, but their milk tasted better than their cheese. And there was somehow a disconnect in there. And I could talk for a long time about the work they did at Harvard. But what I was hoping to illustrate with talking about cheddar is I think cheddar is a really amazing example of where cheese making got caught up in industry. And we in the UK were making hard cow's milk cheeses and on a relatively large scale. Cheesemakers in Cheshire were merrily sending their cheeses off on the ships down the west coast for hundreds of years. We know that the fact that these cheeses were called Cheshire or Lancashire or Leicester was because they were leaving the counties they were made in. So they must have been commercial. But what we see with cheddar is a cheese that has been gripped by, if you think of this Victorian industrial mindset of everything's got to run as smoothly as possible and as efficiently as possible, and we're going to use the technology we have, we're going to possibly abuse our people. So when you're making cheese, a lot of it is sitting around waiting for stuff to happen. And there's potential for a lot of tea breaks, but also an awful lot of cleaning. Now, if you're a busy housewife making that cheese, that's fine. You've got a million and one other things you can get on with. If you are a Victorian dairy owner employing a bunch of people to make your cheese, you don't want them sitting around drinking tea. And so these recipes got tweaked and tweaked and tweaked to make them run faster and faster and faster. And so little things like the temperatures they were working at, the way in which they acidified it. Cheddar makers were amongst the first cheesemakers to really get on board with what became commercial starter cultures and sort of the turn of the 20th century. And even the cheddaring process itself, this idea of in a warm vat, stacking up the blocks of curd and cutting them and stacking them and cutting them and stacking them, is all wonderful techniques for speeding up the make of that cheese. And so we already have this cheese that is something that's designed to fit around an industrial process. I mean, we're still talking very small scale here. But what we also then created were massive, really hard cheeses that could last a long time. And so the best thing to do with them is stick them on ships and send them out around the empire. And so they became the cheeses that went all around the Commonwealth. And the technology went with it. And what I wanted to cover a little bit in talking about cheddar in this is an interesting story about the cloth binding. And having been a cheesemonger on British cheese counters for a very long time, we talk about traditional British cheddars and these cloth-bound cheddars. And the cloth binding came from America, that we sent these hard cow's milk cheeses and how to make them across to New England, across most of the states. But the New England cheesemakers, and in the late 19th century and maybe slightly earlier, were finding that the hot, humid summers made for real difficulties in maturing their cheeses, in particular flies. And I've spent a summer making cheese in New England. It's hot and it's humid and there are a lot of flies. So of course you'd come to crack open your lovely cheddar and find it crawling with maggots. And they needed a covering for those cheeses. Whereas you have the Dutch technology of wax coating your cheeses. When you make something as large as a cheddar, you need to let it breathe. It needs to dry out as it matures. Coupled with this need, with a massive trade in American cotton and Irish linen, and the solution presents itself. And so these cheeses were bound in cotton and then rubbed in the lard that they'd always been rubbed in. And of course, this started to come back. And sometimes cheeses would make their way over to British cheese factors. Or if the cheeses didn't, then certainly the technology did. And I just really love that we have such a wonderful idea of this traditional British cheese. And there's the cloth-bound cheddar, whereas that tiny little bit of cloth binding it was actually brought about by US cheesemakers. In binding the cheese in cloth, it gave them the chance to age it much more in a much more controlled manner. And so this works beautifully. It's not so hot and humid in this country, but it's still damp and you still get a lovely breathable coating, but you can make a larger cheese and you can age it for longer. So I just wanted to share that little cheese making nugget of information with you. So the next cheese, I want us to nip over the channel and head most of the way down France. And we're going to nip over the border, cross the mountains. But these cheeses are all over this sort of region. This particular cheese, Etivaz, is Swiss. And this is a beautiful example. It smells incredible. It smells like cows and hay and a slight tint of smoke, which I will talk about in a second. Etivaz was created as a response to Gruyere production becoming too commercialized. There were a group of cheesemakers who felt like the name was almost being watered down a bit, and they wanted to make something that they felt was truly a quality Gruyere. So it's named after a little village. And it's only made by a handful of makers. And the key thing is it's only made May to October, when the cows are at the top of the wonderful meadows up in the Alps. And it's this transhumance, this moving the cows, that I want to talk about in relation to this cheese, or a Gruyere, or a Comté, or a Beaufort, any of those style of cheeses that you've got in front of you, or maybe have in your fridge, or want to go and buy right now, because it was another collection of solutions to a collection of problems. Now, grazing in that part of the world has incredible potential, but you're dealing with very, very harsh winters, and you have to get the best of the grass, you have to follow the melting snow up the mountain. And that's where you get these incredible, lush, wildflower-filled pastures and the best milk. Now, you don't want to move an entire village up a mountain and down again every year. So everybody's cows go up the mountain with a couple of people, and they deal with the milk every day. And so rather than having a static dairy that your cows come to, you're there in person milking the cows. Now, you've got these 2 or 3 men living in a chalet up on a mountainside, and they've got an awful lot of milk they have to deal with every day with pretty limited technology, because anything they bring, they've got to carry. And slightly easier now when they can put it in a trailer on the back of a Land Rover, but back in the day, that was not possible. And so you end up with these cheeses that are, the milk is heated over an open fire in a large copper cauldron, because you have lots of milk. And so the bacteria that are being used are what we call thermophiles, and they respond much, much better to these higher temperatures, in contrast to our mesophilic middle temperatures of the cheddar, because that's what's going on in Somerset, right? And these higher temperatures, and typically you get those sweeter, caramelized, almost roasted nut flavors from here. And you create these very large cheeses, because you can't carry loads of separate little molds to make smaller cheeses. You have to make 1 or 2 great big cheeses. Now, the other key ingredient to cheese is salt. And salt's really heavy. And the last thing they want to do is carry sack after sack after sack after sack of salt up the mountains with them. There is some salt. And so it's a minimal salt recipe, which means you have to really dry that cheese. And this is where you get these sort of slightly more complicated flavors. You can't make an enormous tall cheese like a cheddar, because you have to make sure the salt you have got is evenly distributed throughout the cheese. So you make a much flatter cheese, hence these large flat discs. And then these cheeses, when they're made, are brought down the mountain, and someone else is responsible for looking after the cheeses. And you have a couple of people in the village will then age those cheeses, and then will be responsible for selling them. And what I find most interesting and what I wanted to share with this is they created a cheese recipe that answered the questions were having to ask with how they found the grazing for their animals. But then what that did, and we don't just see that in this part of Switzerland, we see it in Western France, you see it in northern Italy, you see it in a little bit in Austria and Germany, where the same processes have happened. Parmigiano Reggiano is an absolutely cracking example of this, where the whole community has evolved around how they're handling their cheese. So everything is run through cooperatives, because you only need a handful of people to take the cows up the mountain, but they might as well take everyone's cows. So suddenly it's everyone's milk. And so they are responsible for turning everybody's milk into cheese. But they're stuck up on the mountain, so someone else has to look after the cheeses. And you only need a couple of people to look after cheeses. And so suddenly they're responsible for everybody's cheese. And then that cheese gets sold and the money is redistributed. And these cooperative setups in cheesemaking communities still exist today. And it's what's given such strength, particularly within the PDO structure, but just in general, the consortiums of those cheeses are incredibly powerful bodies. And for young cheesemakers in the area, it's a really natural, it makes it difficult to make a different cheese, but it's a really natural career progression that they have very great structures for getting into the industry. And so the need to move the cows up the mountain changed the whole structure of the community. The last cheese, I've got 10 minutes, that I want to look at. I've got a particularly ooey gooey long in front of me. We went this just because they're flipping amazing at the minute on the counter at the courtyard. But I could be talking about any wash rind cow's milk cheese in northern France or in Belgium, because what I want to talk about really is the effects of the monasteries on cheese making. So far we've looked at some industrial cheese, or at least the birth of industrial cheese. We've looked at cooperative farming communities. And then this is perhaps an example of some of our oldest cheese making, at least in a way that's informed modern European cheese making. So we have something that's, in comparison to the other two we've got, is really fragile. It's soft and gooey. I'm slightly frightened to cut into it. It's going to taste incredible, but I know it's just going to spill all over my cheese board. And so these are not working men's cheeses. They're not something I could stick this bit of vetiver in my pocket and go hiking. I probably would. The longer is not going to survive. And these types of cheeses, things like Liverol and Époisse, that have later informed the sort of stinking bishops of British cheese making, come from a totally different community. They're still subsistence farmers, just in a slightly different way. So they need to produce the cheese because they're responsible, particularly the Cistercian monks, which is where Langres comes from. They have to be responsible for producing almost all their own food. And a diet that's very simple, very bland. It misses out a lot of meat on an awful lot of holy days. And so the idea of having something big and full flavored is going to drive a lot of the decisions. Same story with the beer. But what's important, what I want to talk about here, is the role of the affineur and where that fits into the monasteries. Now, broad brushstrokes, you have your cheesemaker monk, and him and his friends, his whole life is being a monk, and that is an incredibly structured lifestyle. But in between that, he has to make cheese, and these are his things he has to focus on. And so the times outside of prayer or learning or doing works of charity are his cheese making role, and he has a lot of time to think about that cheese making role. This is not something he's doing in the middle of a working day. He's not distracted by other farm animals or children or trying to get cows up a mountain. And he has time to think, well, the cheese yesterday wasn't so great as the cheese today, or when I put it in that corner, it was tastier than when I put them in that corner. And when we connect that in with early modern monasteries as being seats of learning, so these were where our universities grew out of. And whilst they wouldn't have called themselves scientists, they were certainly empiricists and were learning by observation. And this was an act of worship to them. And they had visiting scholars and people traveling around. And so we see the role of the affineur, somebody who's genuinely understanding how to take care of that cheese, how to make it better than the last batch, how to grow a rind in an interesting and delicious way. And you see really innovative ways of doing that. And they had access to really amazing alcohols. And so you see these sticky, stinky, bright orange rind cheeses. More often than not, they've been washed in a local alcohol. For example, the longer I've got is a Marc de Bourgogne, which is a local eau de vie, but it can be washed in a local beer or a different wine, because they had access to this and were able to think about it and try little experiments. And then what you see happening is the cheeses start to travel, because not only were the monasteries seats of learning, they were places with an enormous amount of through traffic, lots of visitors, and not just other people in holy orders. It was really common for aristocracy and royalty to visit monasteries and to stay at monasteries, particularly the more important ones. And these cheeses came to represent not just the monastery, but the region. And so, because the monastery would have an awful lot of land in the area and would have local people working the land for them and looking after the animals. And so this became something that would be served to a visiting dignitary. The wonderful story of brie being served to Charlemagne, for example, is exactly what I'm talking about. So they would serve this as, this is what we've produced in our monastery, but with milk from these cows that are growing on these beautiful pastures looked after by the people whose souls we're also looking after. And that meant the cheeses could travel and the ideas could travel. And this is where you get this abundance of these really fragile little cheeses leaving the area. The two cheeses we talked about before, the cheddar and the étivaz, they're made to travel. Like, nobody's going to care if you stick a cheddar on the back of a cart and take it halfway down the country. That cheddar's going to be pretty much okay. It takes a bit of commitment to move along, particularly pre-roads. And so you see these cheeses start to move about. And what they're doing is they're moving about the country, but they're moving about the country in very refined elite circles. And so this idea of cheese surpassing the diet of the everyday starts, the seeds are sown right there. So they're the three cheeses I want to talk about. I really hope in this absolute whiz through of history, when we went from people basically making cheeses 4,000 years ago, right through to monks and kings and guys up mountains. What I would hope this gives is an idea that cheese making is such an intrinsic part of society and communities that the two can't help but inform one another. They're so intertwined that the recipes change according to what's going on in the world at the time, but also the cheeses themselves start to change how the society is as well, because these were things that came about as a really efficient way of preserving what is an incredibly nutrient-dense foodstuff, but also very perishable. And we've become so reliant on it that it's shaped all of our history as much as history has shaped cheesemaking. I hope you found that really interesting. And you go away and eat some more delicious cheese. And I really hope to see some of these names pop up on some of my Zoom seminars for level 1 and when we add them for level 2 as well. But thank you all so much for attending. Carry on enjoying the cheese weekend. There's so much more coming up. It's going to be brilliant. See you all very soon. Bye-bye.